We're just turning into a century in German cinema podcast now.
This is my secret plan. This is slowly coming into fruition.
Welcome to A Century in Cinema. I'm Arthur.
And I'm Andrew.
And I'm Brian.
Thank you for joining us, Brian.
Hello, everyone. I am Brian Higgins. I'm the impact producer, executive director, and creative director for Mental Health F.i.T. We are a national organization, non-profit. The creative endeavor to end stigma in mental health through films, ideas, and tips.
And Brian is a particular fan of the film that we're watching this week from 1932, Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampyr. So, Brian, you are actually the reason that I chose this film this week. I saw a post, I don't even know when, long time ago. You were just recommending Vampyr and saying that it's one of the best films that you've seen or something like this.
Yeah, for sure. I remember that day specifically because it was actually one of the first Criterions that I ever bought. But I just loved it because it had a big old box and it had the screenplay and had all these extra cool bits and pieces. So I bought it. And for years, it just languished on my shelf. You know, I never got to it. So I must have had it for a good 4 or 5 odd years before I caught it last year. And I just popped it in and I couldn't believe my peepers, you know, for what I was seeing. It just blew me away. And I did. I jumped on Facebook, as we do, and I sung its praises.
Sorry, I missed. Was that the first time you had seen it?
Yeah, I literally, it was just, I was enamored by the box art. Well, the first DVD that I ever bought was Nosferatu. So I'd sort of been hypnotized by silent era, you know, vampire and monster films before getting into the Universal monsters. And I sort of just lumped Vampyr in with that. And as I say, it just never caught me to actually watch it until last year.
Buying a Criterion Blu-ray just off the box art is quite a bold move. Those things are pricey.
I do it all the time, Arthur. I do it so much. It's so bad.
Well, all my Criterion buys are all blind buys these days because I have to trust that, you know, they're a Criterion for a reason. They are the only physical mediums that I buy anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So before we turn into a Criterion podcast, let me try to steer us back to the year 1932. What's going on in the year 1932? So in most developed countries, unemployment is hovering around 25%, a pretty huge number that will remain high for quite a while. In the US, there are shanty towns, people living out of their cars, people riding trains looking for work. If you don't know about the bonus army, that's worth looking up. It's a pretty bad situation. Following up from last week, Al Capone is arrested this year on tax evasion. Turns out illegally earned income is still subject to income tax under United States law. Also in the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected president, and the U.S. refuses to acknowledge Japan's conquered territory in Manchuria. Another little follow-up from last week. That is a point that will escalate as time goes on. In India this year, Mahatma Gandhi goes on his hunger strike. This was to protest new British laws that would have divided the electoral system into castes for the upper class and lower class. Okay, so our film this week is coming again from Germany. Due to losing the World War, Germany is hit especially hard by the Depression. The aid that other countries were lending to help rebuild the country has dried up. Unemployment there is at 30%, and the government is ripe for a party like the Nazis to take over. There's desperation and resentment throughout the population. Again, a point that will escalate. Looking at the film industry, Technicolor is sort of beginning to take off right now. Technicolor, the company, is still negotiating and sort of convincing the Hollywood studios to adopt color film. But Disney is one of the first studios to take up the process. Andrew, you mentioned the short film Flowers and Trees in a previous episode.
Yes.
And That's a very early example of a film produced in Technicolor. And that's this year, that's 1932.
And Technicolor is when it's like the 3 different colored strips are right over each other.
Yeah, that becomes the process that they end up settling on. That becomes colored film. Technicolor is the name of a company that that pioneers that process. And cool, that's what I got as far as the little history lesson.
That's great. I love it. I just figured since we are making this in the year of a pandemic and this week we have a guest, one of the main questions I've gotten is how we are making this podcast. And I just sort of wanted to explain, we're all in our different homes recording these on our own personal recording software through Audition. We clap at the beginning of every single take to sync up our audio, and then it all just gets sent to Arthur and he kills it and does a really great edit and makes everybody sound really smart and eloquent. And that's what you're hearing.
It's easier when everyone is really smart and eloquent already. So thank you, everyone.
There you go.
So yeah, that's how we're doing it. I've actually never seen Andrew Slaughter's face in my life.
That's not true.
The plot of Vampyr is a little meandering, a little hard to explain, but Brian, do you want to take a stab at it?
I will do my best. No, I'll be terrible at this because I've got my own perceptions of what it is, and that'll be spoilers ahoy.
This is a spoiler-friendly podcast, though. You can totally spoil as much as you want.
Well, for a film from 1932,
Right.
I don't want to get the angry comments that I spoiled it for people. It's about this fella, and it's kind of along the lines of the standard Dracula story about the guy that is a fish out of water, basically. And it goes back to that old saying that there's only 2 stories. There's either a man goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. And this sort of fits into both of those. He has come to this strange town and he has started to witness these strange anomalies happening. But could it all be a dream as well? And I suppose that's what I will say.
There you go.
Should we go into our impressions of the film?
Well, I want to hear you first, Arthur, because you're of the 3 of us, this is your first time watching the film. Brian and I have both seen it before.
So this film reminded me a lot of Victor Sjöström's The Phantom Carriage in that it just feels like one of those, antiquated is the wrong word, but it feels like it was dug up or unearthed and just like you're almost not supposed to be watching it. And it's this weird, atmospheric sequence of scenes that don't feel like they're really connected in a real story. It really does feel like you're wandering through a dream, doesn't it? And it quickly becomes sort of nightmarish, especially when the shadows show up, the disembodied shadows, which I thought was such a beautiful, amazing sequence. And that kind of sets the tone for this eerie, unsettling journey through this small town and into this strange world where you don't really know what's real and what to believe. I really liked it, but I was confused through most of it. How about that?
That's fair.
Yes, I agree too. It is a very confusing film. I find it's difficult to, depending on what version you watch, because the title cards are not in English. So it's difficult to, follow the story. So you're really just allowing the dream world of it to wash over you. And that's what I get out of it the most is the technical standpoint of it and myself trying to interpret what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So from the technical standpoint, I was amazed by the camera work, for a film of this era. And again, just some of the composition of the shots are just gorgeous, absolutely phenomenal. Of course, the special effects were all done in camera. There wasn't any digital effects back then. But some of the forward-thinking and ambitious elements of this, specifically the ghosts, the shadows dancing on the walls, I thought were incredible and very reminiscent of the Haunted Mansion, although without the Pepper's Ghost aspect of it. A lot of that is just very consuming. to really to experience what is going on in what's the main guy's name?
The main guy's name, Alan Gray.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What's going on in his mind? Because I feel a lot of it is POV
Right.
from his standpoint, and you're sort of floating around in his dream world, and just the interpretive ambition, as I say, of Dreyer to be able to put this together in this day and age.
So, Brian, I have a question for you. You mentioned that you were also interested in Nosferatu, which is a much earlier film than Vampyr, and that you were also interested in the Universal monster movies like Dracula. So is there something about the vampire myth that sort of speaks to you, that you're drawn to?
Well, I will say that vampires and Dracula are my most disliked of the mythical monsters. I'm very much more a werewolf guy.
Okay.
And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde
yeah.
aspect. Another one of my passions is Jack the Ripper. A bit of a ripperologist. Whenever the files got released to the public after they were sealed for 100 years, because my dad was chief inspector of the police back home, so he was able to get them for me from Scotland Yard. And my bedroom at the time was a cliched police detective's bedroom, and I had all of these files and all of these things written all over my wall and all of the clues, because I was convinced at 12 years old that I was going to solve who Jack the Ripper was once I got all these things. And I just remember the heart failure my mom must have had coming into my room and seeing all these photographs of all his victims. But part of that is Ripper films. I love Ripper films, and specifically The Lodger, because The Lodger has been remade 6 times, and beginning with Hitchcock's version. And it's great to be able to see the progression of film as a technology. As I say, I got the Criterion this year, so I'm excited to plonk that in on a dark, snowy night.
Very nice.
Absolutely. Yeah, watching a movie really is all about the surrounding experience going on.
As I say, I will always love Nosferatu.
Mm-hmm.
I remember watching that the first time. It was my art teacher had a VHS copy of it. You guys might be a bit too young for this, but when it was a special day at school when they would roll the TV and the VCR into the room, and I knew it was going to be a TV day.
Oh, I love those days. I still have them.
Yeah, there was a specific memory of the 4th grade Spy Kids being the movie they played. That being like the best day.
And it was my art teacher, and he decided, like, he must have just got a copy of a VHS. I don't know if it was recorded off TV, whatever, but he made us all watch it. And everyone else was bored to tears, but I was so enthralled. Again, I'd never seen anything like that at that stage. And that was really one of my gateway drugs into the world of film.
That like costume and the makeup in Nosferatu is so creepy even today. It's so unsettling.
Oh, for sure. And I put Nosferatu and Vampyr in different categories than Dracula.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
I think Dracula is so mundane and so, just pale in comparison to these. It's hard these days to find new elements within the mythology, because you're always going to get the, sunlight, the garlic, the stake through the heart. But this is the only one that I've found that if you commit suicide, process in that act still gives the vampire the power over you rather than sucking their blood. Did that become apparent to you guys watching it?
I mean, what I really loved about Vampyr was kind of what you said. There's this stale feeling to a lot of vampire films we see in modern films. But this felt fresh because it felt so old, and it was tied to the folklore and the European mythology of like medieval vampires. So much of what we see in Vampyr feels so strange and otherworldly because it's tied to the older version of this vampire myth, not the universal Dracula that he's turning into a bat. And this felt a lot more grounded and for that reason a lot spookier.
Yeah, and there's also I really going back to what Brian said about the mythology being switched up. I really love the long iron stake being like what they put through, as opposed to the more traditionally thought upon smaller wooden stakes. Yeah, I love the way this film plays with mythology of vampires, and it does take a lot from the short story that it was based upon, but it does create a lot of its own rules as well. I think it does make the vampire a much more interesting phenomenon than, say, Dracula.
So what did you think of it, Andrew?
Oh, I love this movie. Yeah. And I didn't even think about what Brian said about the intertitles. I always watch this with the English intertitles on, which I don't know if that's considered sacrilege, but Criterion created like kind of a painstaking restoration of it with English intertitles over the book to make it easier to read. And it looks so good. They did such a great job with it. So I always watch it like that. I don't think I'll ever be able to see that shot of the shadow getting down from the windowsill. And it just sends shivers up my spine every single time. I love that so much. Yeah, I didn't watch this with the roommates or anything this time around. People were pretty busy this past week, but I really enjoyed revisiting it. I also revisited a lot of his films that I love because I just saw an opportunity to dive fully into Dreyer again. And I think he's one of the greatest directors who ever lived. So that was really nice as well.
Watching this film, I totally forgot that it was a sound film. Even like when people are talking, I still kind of see this as a silent film.
But anything, and really in any film, like if you're going to make a film today, I always try, from my own standpoint of filmmaking, I look at it, if this was silent, if someone just turned the volume off, could they still work out what was going on? And I think that's a good litmus test for film these days. Without the dialogue, without any sound, can you still enjoy it? Can you still get the entire gist of the story just from the imagery? And a ton of stuff you can't, and that's really like the connection to great directors, great storytellers, just because it is a visual medium.
Yeah, I completely agree with that sentiment. I mean, I've always considered myself to be someone who will appreciate aesthetics of a film over any other aspect of it, as long as the imagery and the way the whole thing comes together makes me feel a certain way, and that is what they're intending, then I think it's a successful project. And I've also wondered the same thing before of watching certain films and thinking, if they weren't literally saying what was happening and talking about what was going on, would I be able to understand the thematic nature of this piece? Would I be able to understand what emotions this is trying to convey? And I do consider that to be a very important part of film as well.
And I think this film does a great job of that too. I mean, you definitely could watch this without any sound and still derive quite a bit from it. You might not be able to tell what's going on, because even with sound, I wouldn't be able to tell exactly what's going on. Like, really? But like you said, the emotional impact is what's important. And this does have the atmosphere. This does have the creepy nature that you want from an unsettling horror film. I think it works really well. Yeah,
it's wonderful for like arty haunted houses to just have it projected as you're walking around the halls.
Yeah, I've had this film actually playing on silent with music and stuff playing at Halloween parties before. I love doing stuff like that.
So Andrew, since this was Dreyer's first sound film, you can tell that he still has one foot in the silent era. Do you want to talk a little bit about his transition into this era of filmmaking?
It's interesting because Denmark actually started out having a film industry early on, but then pretty much as soon as he started to get into the filmmaking industry was when Denmark stopped going towards that industry entirely, and he had to go to Sweden, Germany, stuff like that. But one of his earliest films, Master of the House, which is a silent film, is considered one of the early depictions of feminism and a mature view of gender politics within film. Yeah, his style really shows through that. And also there's another film called Michael, which is really, really great. These are all on YouTube. That needs to be stated as well. I think even Vampyr, I think every single Dreyer film is on YouTube for free. So he's a director definitely worth getting into. The main thing that comes through in Vampyr, it's so obvious, is his use of shadows, which is something that was always prominent in his career very, very early on. But this film really takes that aspect and runs with it. especially with the way he uses shadow puppetry and different aspects of movement of the camera to make it seem as if the shadows are their own entities that are running around. This film was also supposed to be in 3 different languages, German, French, and English. And he purposely wanted to avoid dialogue to avoid complications with that issue. And when all of his silent film sensibilities really came into play was his ability to convey this film and its ideas with very, very sparse dialogue. And he does use intertitles. Those are the main carryovers from the silent era into this film, I think. There's not a lot of dialogue at all in this movie.
The film right before this that he directed was The Passion of Joan of Arc. Is that correct?
Yes. 4 years before, I think.
And that's considered by many people to be like his masterpiece, his magnum opus.
Yeah, and it is interesting how, I mean, it's still an aesthetic masterpiece, but just how different that film is from this one. This film has so many effects and so many crazy location shots, and Passion of Joan of Arc is almost entirely a close-up of one actress's face. But they are both very visceral, emotional films that take you on a journey through their imagery and create a world that feels so soaked in dread and so soaked in almost a layer of hopelessness. Vampyr actually has a surprisingly happy ending, all things considered, especially when you do consider Passion of Joan of Arc, which, you know, I mean, it ends like the actual story did, in absolute tragedy. But, I mean, I've seen all but of a couple of his films. I need to just get on those.
I guess my question is, does he always stick with the silent film sort of aesthetic and the structure of silent films, or does he eventually get into...
So even though his final film was 1964, he never made a color film. And I would say, as far as the way the images are conveyed, he doesn't ever leave those silent film sensibilities behind. Vampyr is his last film with intertitles. So he does rely on dialogue to get across basic aspects of the plot. But especially in something like Day of Wrath, which is his film about the witch trials, that entire movie is mostly just people slowly reacting to each other, and guilt is being spread across the whole house, and people are thinking that one person is responsible for witchcraft and this other person is responsible for witchcraft, and there's a full protagonist switch. It's so brilliant, but that entire film is almost entirely portrayed just with people glancing at each other. And it's phenomenal. It's probably my favorite of his work.
That sounds like Passion of Joan of Arc, a bunch of close-ups.
Yeah.
So as an early horror film, what influences do you see from Vampyr that impact horror movies going forward?
The performers, I'll say, in this were all non-actors. They were just villagers that were around that had the right look. So a lot of the deformities were coming from veterans from World War One.
Oh, wow.
Which I always think is a standpoint in horror, because you can really see how makeup changed. If we look at Lon Chaney and stuff, people that had genuinely been in the trenches, you know, and they'd seen horror. So now just the black eye makeup wasn't going to do it for them anymore. So a lot of the people that had been disfigured in the trenches were able to get new careers as bit part actors. And you can see a couple of them in this. And the same goes after Vietnam. We can see that there was another leap in horror makeup, specifically for people that were in Vietnam and had genuinely seen heads blowing off and things like that. Specifically, Tom Savini was a pioneer and really upping the game in horror effects. So it was nice to see a couple of people from that standpoint. The unseen protagonist. So was it supernatural? Those aspects, plus the way, again, spoilers ahoy, but the way the doctor dies at the end, where he drowns in the flower. I always thought that was would be a horrific death. the version that I remember that is in Witness with Harrison Ford, where the guys they drown in the wheat. So that I thought that was very reminiscent, whether or not they were paying an homage to this. But
what a horrific scene, by the way, too. The doctor drowning in the flour at the end.
Yeah, that was actually censored as well. There was 3 specific scenes that were cut due to terror, and that was one of the scenes. There was a lot more close-ups when he was actually asphyxiating that they cut out, and those scenes do exist. They're very bad quality.
I can say that this film feels like a lot of horror movies that I've seen recently in its pacing. I feel like there's a trend in horror movies now for a lot of slow atmospheric buildup, especially the films coming out of A24 like The Witch and Midsommar. Yeah, there's a certain pacing that they could have drawn inspiration from Vampyr.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure, yeah.
Andrew, what about you? Are you a big horror movie fan?
I love horror movies. I actually just finished for October watching all the Nightmare on Elm Streets. I can't tell you that I drew a lot of comparisons to Vampyr in those films, but I can tell you I had a great time watching them. I would agree with you, though, especially actually the one that shoots out to me immediately is Hereditary. I loved that film, and that film feels very deliberate, like this one, of making sure the terror and suspense is building up slowly, brimming right under the surface. And then everything just explodes right in the last 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. I love when a film is able to do that successfully. It is very easy to do that and make a very, very boring film that might have an exciting finale, but contains no rewatch value.
That's right.
Well, Vampyr also has the benefit of being 72 minutes long. Still has this momentum behind it, and you're wondering what's going to happen next. And there's always, even if it's super subtle, there's always some sort of reveal of information, some new trick being brought into the image to entice you further. Yeah, it really sets a precedent of how to make a slow burn atmospheric horror film.
Yeah, and I can't think of too many other films from this era that I've seen or that we've watched recently that have the same sort of build-up.
It's so funny because we probably should have just watched it, but because we've talked about it in so many different podcasts, but I think Cabinet of Dr. Caligari...
Oh, for sure, yep.
...is a fair point of comparison to this film in that regard.
Oh, okay.
We've now mentioned, I think that the three main influences behind Vampyr are in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, and The Lodger. I really would say those are the 3 main points of comparison you could make as far as films of this era before it are concerned. I guess I'm entertained when I'm being unsettled. Is that fair?
Andrew, Brian, are you entertained when you are focused on religious oppression in films? And how do those themes translate into Vampyr?
Well, my whole life has an origin story of religious oppression.
Yeah, you can say that again.
Yeah, like I don't like, again. There's always the religious aspect, because with vampire films, the crucifix and everything, Christianity, good versus evil type thing. I don't feel, in my understanding, that there was much religious overtones within Vampyr. Of course, in the in other films, and there's a point that I wanted to bring up earlier, but so with Joan of Arc, I did a film festival about 5 years ago in Albuquerque, and it was a religious festival, so to speak. It was very much a community of congregations from local churches that come to this specific festival, and we were screening Joan of Arc, but unfortunately, the print that was shipped to us did not come with a soundtrack. Of course, we thought, well, we can get a soundtrack, we can get one off YouTube, whatever, and play it. But we thought it would be a good experience to play it completely silent, with no sound at all. And I will say, sitting in that theater with a full theater of religious people watching this very religious film without a sound, that was a religious experience for me. To truly connect with the imagery And without the ability for me to move, or for any of the audience, even to creak the chairs and just to experience the beauty on screen, was something that I certainly never expected to experience. And it was just one of those lovely serendipitous moments that we all could experience together. So
that sounds incredible.
Yeah, it really was, because people were so respectful. Again, the audience that came to it knew what they were in for. We didn't announce, so it's going to be silent, truly silent, until we started the film. And I don't think a modern audience would be able to sit through that, without playing on their phones or without getting up and go. But nobody moved. Like, it was such an old theater, and it was just full of the Holy Spirit, I would have to say. It was a wonderful, wonderful time.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever had an experience like that in a theater, I don't think. But yeah, that sounds incredible. Andrew, you did put in here that Dreyer often focuses on religion and religious oppression. Is that true in Vampyr? Is that here as much as it is in his other films, or is it kind of the black sheep amongst his filmography?
I think that Dreyer is very drawn to religious material. It's very interesting because he was kind of a conservative man when it came to his political views, and he made a lot of films that feel very critical of religion. But when you read interviews with people who worked with him, or you look into his life, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence of him personally being a very religious person. But he clearly was very drawn to the subject. Same with being drawn to the subject of the fair treatment of women within film. It's funny because I want to talk about these so much, but Vampyr is the black sheep in his filmography as far as both of those themes go. But the short story that it's based off of actually features those themes kind of heavily. The name of the short story is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. Another little Criterion shout out. This short story is included in the edition of Vampyr, which is how I read it. And I thought it was a very entertaining book. I feel like he was drawn to that material because it is so female-centric and involves a lot of religious themes. And this movie is sort of him taking the ideas from that short story. And I feel like he saw Nosferatu, and because we definitely know that he did see that film, was mildly inspired by it at least. There's a great interview with the lead actor of this film where he talks about that. But I think that this is sort of his take on what he would have wanted in Nosferatu, and I don't think he would have had the basis for it if he hadn't been so drawn to that source material, which does contain the themes that he likes to work into his films. So that's interesting. If we were talking about Day of Wrath, I would be able to talk about this for hours because that's literally all that film is about, is religious oppression and women being blamed for things that they are not in control of. But yeah, I guess I would call this the black sheep in his filmography. Roundabout way of saying yes, Arthur.
Brian, have you read the short story?
No, I have not.
I'm looking at it. The character is a prototypical example of the lesbian vampire.
Oh my gosh, there was so much gay in that book. It was so good. It was actually very entertaining. It's only like 70 pages. I wouldn't call this a straight adaptation of Carmilla in any way. It just takes the rules that it uses for vampirism, twists those a little bit, and there's the ominous sense of dread that we've talked about this film builds up and bubbles up to. That's all that book is. It opens with her having a nightmare about seeing a woman when she was a child. And as the book goes on, she sees that woman again, but she's an adult now, and they become friends. And as the reader, you're just noticing these little details in the story she's recounting, and you're thinking something's not quite right. It almost felt unfair to read it knowing it was going to be a vampire short story, but it gets very, very sexual between them, not in like any sort of crass way. It's just, I guess it'd probably be more fair to say sensual between them. And it was very interesting. And also Carl Theodor Dreyer made Michael, which I mentioned earlier, which is considered one of the earliest films about homosexuality, and it doesn't condemn it in any way. There you go. There's connections all about. What does it all mean? I don't know. But there are connections all about.
Well, I didn't find any review from the time period that I could source, but on Wikipedia, they quote quite a few publications from the time. And I'll tell you right now that everyone seemed to really not like this movie.
It was a flop. It was a second huge flop in a row after Passion of Joan of Arc.
Yeah, so I have here at the Berlin premiere, the New York Times wrote, "Whatever you think of the director, there is no denying that he is different.
He's not like the other girls.
He does things that make people talk about him. You may find his films ridiculous, but you won't forget them. Although in many ways, Vampyr was one of the worst films I have ever attended." It sounds so dismissive, and that's sad, knowing that this was the second flop in a row.
And what's really interesting about this film, I think this is sort of a key in to Dreyer's sensibilities as a director. After Passion of Joan of Arc flopped, this was supposed to be kind of his big banking on this needs to succeed movie. And he makes Vampyr, which I have nothing but positive things to say about, but does not feel like it is in any way designed to be some sort of heavy blockbuster for that time period, in the way other films might feel, like a MGM musical or something like that. I don't know. It's just so funny. We've all talked about how the plot is confusing to the point of almost being unnecessary to interpret, and it's mostly supposed to make you feel like you're in this dream state, and just to imagine making something that's so dependent on aesthetics and being like, this is gonna be my big money maker. I don't know, it's just funny to think about.
Well, luckily the film has gotten a lot more positive reviews recently, and I don't know when the perception of this film sort of shifted, but it seems like it's held in very high regard amongst cinephiles in today's world.
Just jump on that Criterion. It is chock full of special features and commentaries and versions and documentaries. And again, another great Criterion that you could do a double feature with is Haxan.
Oh, great. Have you seen that, Arthur?
I haven't. I'm trying to look it up right now. How do you spell it?
Haxan. Hacks on, hacks off.
Yes, hacks on, hacks off. Good stuff.
Yeah, speaking of films that feel like they're antiquated and feel like there's something you shouldn't be watching, that movie feels legitimately cursed.
Andrew, what are we watching next week?
Oh, so funny. You should ask. Oh, yeah, I know this without looking it up. Next week, we will be watching Babyface, a pre-code Hollywood dramedy.
We'll be discussing the Hays Code.
It is definitely the definition of what people consider to be pre-code Hollywood.
And that is actually available to rent on Amazon for $1.99, as well as Google Play, Apple. Yeah, it's not super hard to find.
Okay, there you go.
Brian, we really appreciate you joining us for this episode. I'm really glad that you recommended Vampyr way back when and that it found its way onto our list.
Good stuff. Well, thanks for having me, and I would love to pop back on if you're interested.
Yeah, talking to both of you about movies at the same time just makes me feel like I'm at the tower again. I feel so good. Thank you for joining us, Brian. Such a pleasure.
Indeed. Happy days.
You too.
Ta-ta.
Would like to say thank you so much to Nathan Royal for our show's music. If you're enjoying A Century in Cinema, we would love if you took a second to help support us. Leave us a rating, a review, and, go ahead and give us a subscription. Recommend us to someone else who likes movies. Thank you so much, and we will have a new episode next week.
I just want to give a shout out to all our Patreon members who keep the show running. Thank you all. You too can become a patron and get access to bonus episodes, linked down in the show notes. You're listening on YouTube now, so like and subscribe and comment down below. Tell us if you've seen the film. What did you think of it? Did we miss anything? Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.